Hi, everyone. Welcome back to part two of my lecture, All the King's Horses and All the King's Men, looking at the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. If you haven't yet, stop, pause, and go back and listen to part one of this lecture. And I'm going to pick up where we left off, which is talking about the prophets Elijah and Elisha. Elijah's story, one of my favorites in the Old Testament. So his name, Elijah, means God is my Lord. And he prophesied in the northern kingdom, Israel, the topmost portion of the kingdoms. He became the heart and conscience of the people in the absence of righteous leadership from their king. He pronounced truth and judgment when needed, as was the role of God's prophets, especially to Ahab. Ahab goes so far astray because of his wicked wife, Jezebel. Uh, Elijah also provided for the ordinary people of faith. So we do encounter some ordinary Israelites in his story because of his interactions with them. For one, the widow at Zarephath is an example of that. And he is contrasted with the wicked Jezebel. She was a Phoenician princess who worshipped the god Baal, and she was married to the faithless King Ahab and led him astray and really becomes a persecutor of Elijah. She pursues him to every possible end of the earth in order to cut him down because she is so opposed to him and to God in general. So the big feature in Elijah's story, there's several miracles that are part of his story, but the one I want to focus on is the showdown at Mount Carmel, because this is an astounding story and it's a well told story. There's humor involved in it, there's sarcasm. It's a good one. So it happens in 1 Kings 18, verses 20 through 40. And I wish I could read the whole thing to you because it is such a good story. And it's really, it serves us well to read it out loud because you can interject that sarcasm into the words. But take some time and read it yourself if you can. So in this story, God definitively showed himself to be God. Jezebel has set herself up. She has set up her prophets and her religion as the main one in this northern kingdom. And God is not going to let that stand. So in this story, through Elijah, he confronts both Jezebel and her prophets. And he forces the people to decide who would they serve. And if you know the story, it is this huge showdown on top of the mountain. The God says, have all of Jezebel's prophets come, and they do. And Elijah says, okay, I'm going to prepare this altar, and whichever God can, light a fire on this altar, that is the one true God, or the true God. And so the prophets, as they did in the ancient Near East, run about, they're screaming and shouting, they're cutting themselves, doing everything that they can to invoke their false gods, to no avail, of course, because the false gods are not real. And Elijah kind of says sarcastically, oh, maybe you need to just be louder. Maybe he's away. Maybe your God is just traveling at the moment and can't hear you. And once this frenzy ends, then Elijah steps up to the plate and God lights the altar on fire, despite the fact that Elijah has doused it with water. I mean, it is a definitive showdown. The only God would have been able to set that blaze. And so the people do choose God. They fall down at their feet and say, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. And unfortunately, this faithfulness does not last, but for the moment, it is quite a triumph. And then afterwards, God has Elijah kill the prophets of Jezebel. So, as you can imagine, that was a lot to handle. And after this event, Elijah suffers. He goes into a period of depression. He is depleted and exhausted, just in such need of care, which God gives to him. And then once he has been cared for, once his physical needs have been attended to, Elijah flees and he goes to that same mountain where Moses saw the glory of God in the story of Exodus. And Elijah will also be met by God's glory there, but in a different way than Moses. So I have a picture if you're able to view this presentation or the PDF. of what it looks like from the top of Mount Carmel. And it's a view of the valley of Megiddo. So Megiddo is where the final battle in Revelation, Armageddon, will take place. It is also where Jezebel and Ahab had their summer palace. So from their summer palace, they could have seen to the top of Mount Carmel and to the fire that God lit and the frenzy of events that were happening. And I also have a picture of that summer palace. The remains of it are still in Israel, and you can see kind of the outline of the palace of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. If you dig a little deeper, underneath where their palace was an old Canaanite altar. And it was an altar upon which they would have sacrificed humans. So that was underlying this palace. And that is true of a lot of the sites in Israel. They would build cities on top of the ruins of other cities because the cities were put where they had access to fresh water. And so you might destroy a city, but you couldn't go start fresh somewhere else because you needed to be near that water. So they would just build on top of it. And so now when archaeologists go and engage in excavations, they will find layers that speak to the different people that inhabited that city over time. So just interesting. Of course, the wicked Jezebel would have built a palace on top of what had been a site for human sacrifice. So Elijah, he is at this mountain, Mount Horeb, where Moses encountered the glory of God. Remember the story of Moses? He boldly asked to see God's glory, and God said, well, I can't, because if I show you my full glory, you won't survive. But I will hide you in the cleft of the rock, and I will allow you to see part of my glory as I pass by. That's where Elijah goes. And it makes sense, right? Like, yes, of course, he's going to want to go to the place where he knows that God came to Moses because he is still suffering. His physical needs had been attended to, but he was still in this place of deep depression. He felt like he was all alone in the world. It was him against Jezebel and all of her minions, and he had no one to stand on his side, God, of course, but no other human. And you can imagine the loneliness and the difficulties that ensued. So he travels for 40 days and nights to reach Mount Horeb. And when he gets there, he goes in a cave to sleep. So remember, Moses was in the cleft of a rock. Sounds like a cave, right? So Elijah does the same thing. And God does appear to him, and he hears the voice of God, and God says, go stand on the mountain, for my presence is about to pass by. That sounds like the Moses story too. But before he actually encounters God's presence, a few things happen. So first, there's this huge wind. I mean, it's an understatement. It's so powerful that it is tearing the mountain apart. Its rocks are crashing to the ground. This is a hurricane force wind. Then that dies down, and then an earthquake comes and shakes the foundation. And then there's a roaring fire. These are all noisy, powerful, physical events that could have had, would have had the element of not just seeing, but hearing and even smelling what is happening. The smell of the fire, the smell of the earth being churned, all of this, like just a cacophony of loudness. And then we read, and depending on what version you're reading, in the NIV it says, God comes in a gentle whisper. God's voice comes to him. And when he hears that, he goes out and stands at the mouth of the cave to receive God's word. But this provoked a whole week's worth of discussion in my Hebrew class about what that translation means, because the Hebrew word for voice can also, that means voice here, can also mean silence, that's just so interesting in and of itself. What a juxtaposition. But it could be that it's a gentle whisper. It could also be translated equally well, something like a loud silence. So I was in the camp of translating it loud silence because of my own experience. I have 4 children. They are teenagers into their early 20s now, but back when they were all small, there's 7 years between the oldest and the youngest. I had a lot of kids at home, and trust me, silence was much louder than noise. Noise, I blinked it out. But when I heard nothing, that silence was loud because I knew something was going on that shouldn't have been going on. And that's why I feel like this is well translated, a loud silence. After all of that, all the things that we think God would show up in, the noise and the sheer force of nature being upheaved, here comes this silence. And then God speaks into that. Oh, I love that imagery, don't you? So either way, you can translate it, by the way, if you love the gentle whisper. Like, I do not want to rob you of that. That is equally as good of a translation. I just wanted to throw in there the loud silence because I know some of us know that silence can be very loud. So after this, God gives Elijah some very practical instructions. And also in those instructions, a friend. He tells him to go and anoint Elisha. And so this is going to be finally someone that Elijah can have at his side so that he will not be physically, humanly alone anymore. So what a gift God gave him in that, and the relationship that he has with Elisha. So Elisha's name means my God is salvation. And he too prophesied in the northern kingdom of Israel. He is Elijah's apprentice. And if we know from the story, he asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. And God granted that. Now, note, when he asked it, Elijah didn't go, oh, yes, absolutely, because he knew that it was not Elijah's to grant. If God wanted to give Elisha a double portion, that was up to God. And so Elijah wisely allowed God to be the one to decide, and God did give him a double portion. And so he followed in Elijah's footsteps. He continued to call out the evil doings of the leadership of Israel. And in fact, he does seem to get a double portion because he does. The miracles of Elisha even seem to outnumber those of Elijah. So some of the many miracles Elisha performed: he purified the water at Jericho, he multiplied the widow's oil, he brought back to life the son of the Shunammite woman. So both of those stories, the widow with the oil and the Shunammite woman, allow us to encounter some everyday Israelites. He fed 100 men with leftovers, which sure speaks to the future and what Jesus is going to do, feeding 5,000 with bread and fish. He healed Naaman, who was not an Israelite. He healed his leprosy. And then even after his death, he continues to be miraculous. He is put in a tomb, and then later on, a body is thrown into the tomb of Elisha, and the man comes back to life after he touches Elisha's bones. So even after death, has like this huge outpouring of the Holy Spirit. It's amazing. So the army of God, Elisha, I love this story too. So whereas I kind of highlighted for you one of the stories of Elijah, that showdown at Mount Carmel, I feel like this is the significant story of Elisha's role as prophet. So he warns the king of Israel, Joram was the king at the time, about an impending attack. The Arameans are about to attack. And so Elisha says, hey, keep a lookout for what's going to happen. And the Aramean king finds out, and he gets so mad. And he's like, even accuses his men. Which one of you is in cahoots with Elisha or with Israel? Like, who is telling the king about this? And they say, it's not us. It's the prophet Elisha. Their God is speaking to him and telling him what's going to happen. And so the Aramean king says, well, go and find him and kill him. And so then we read the story of 2 Kings 6, verses 13 through 17. So I want to read this to you. If you have your Bible and you're a place where you can pull it out, you might want to pull it out and follow along. So the king has sent men to go find Elisha and kill him. And Elisha is with a servant. And it says, when the servant of God, this is starting in, we'll start in verse 13. Go find out where he is, the king ordered. So he's talking about Elisha. So I can send men and capture him. And the report came back, he is in Dothan. So then the king sent horses and chariots and a strong force there. They went by night and surrounded the city. So it's just Elisha and his servant surrounded by this army from Aramea. When the servant of the man got up and went out early the next morning, an army with horses and chariots had surrounded the city. Oh no, my lord, what shall we do? The servant asked. Don't be afraid, the prophet Elisha answered. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And Elisha prayed, "Open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see." Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. Oh, I love that story. It's amazing. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. The unseen army of God far outnumbered the physical army of the Aramean king, and Elisha knew this. And after that, those words, God blinded the eyes of the Aramean soldiers, and it allowed Elisha to lead them to Samaria, which was the capital of the northern kingdom, Israel. And there, Elisha advised the king, don't kill the men, but let them go, because that's even going to be more of a testimony to God than if you just outright killed them. And so now we see turn towards to the downward slide of the northern kingdom. So after this happens, the Arameans do lay siege to Samaria, and it lasts so long that the people of Samaria ate one another. So this is the Israelites. So we talked about this in another lecture about this prophecy that things were going to get so bad that at one point the people were going to become cannibals. And here it is. Here it is in the northern kingdom. So this is 2 Kings 6, starting in verse 28 through 29, where they talk about this. So this is just right after this amazing story of Elisha and his servant kind of seeing God's army protecting them. But unfortunately, it's not enough. Again, we see that the prophets often are not able to sway the kings. The kings of Israel, for the most part, are evil and don't listen to the prophets. And so here we see that the people ate one another. So it says in these verses, starting in 28, a woman comes to tell the king, and the king says, what's going on? And she answered, this woman said to me, give up your son so we may eat him today, and tomorrow we'll eat my son. So we cooked my son and ate him. The next day I said to her, give up your son so we may eat him, but she had hidden him. So these women had come to an agreement, we'll eat my son today and your son tomorrow, and they ate the one woman's son, and then the second woman did not keep up her end of the deal and hid her son. That's how bad things have gotten in the northern kingdom. It is bad. It is as bad as things can get. So after this incident, the next Aramean king, which is Hazael, causes more trouble for Israel. And then comes the Assyrians. The Assyrians rose to power. They conquered everybody else, basically, and they invade Israel to try to conquer them as well. And they're led at the time by Tiglath-Pileser. He conquers most of Israel and deports the people to Assyria during the reign of King Pekah. So it's a kind of a two-stage deportation and exile. First, he gets like everybody except the capital, takes them off, and then there's another siege. So the final king of Israel is Hoshea, and he made a covenant with the Assyrian king Shalmaneser. Oh, these names. But he betrays him. So he makes a covenant. Remember that kind of covenant relationship where he says, I'll be loyal to you if you offer me protection against Assyria, or against other people groups. So he makes a deal to kind of try to spare the life of the rest of Israel, that northern kingdom, but then he betrays him. And he makes a side deal with the Egyptian king, which was not allowed. If you had a covenant and you were the lesser party, you were not allowed to have a covenant with more than one greater party. So Assyria invades again and lays siege to the capital, Samaria, which was all that was left, for 3 years. So we can imagine how bad things got. And then he finally gains control of Samaria, and he takes into captivity the rest of that northern kingdom. So at that point, everybody's gone from the northern kingdom. So in 2 Kings 17, verses 16 through 20, it says that Israel was taken into captivity. This happened in 722 BC by Assyria, and this was what had been prophesied during the reign of Jeroboam. By the way, these tribes are considered the lost tribes because they are never said to come back to the Holy Land. The Assyrians were brutal. They actually murdered most of these people. And then others, they so assimilated into their culture that they lost their sense of identity or they enslaved them. So whoever remained kind of lost that feeling of being part of Israel. And then in turn, they either killed or took away the native Israelites, and they repopulated that area with their own people or with other people that they had conquered. But this caused trouble. There was still trouble. So they bring kind of Assyrians and others. They populate that area of northern Israel. And then they notice that things aren't going well for them. So they say, well, we'll allow one Israelite priest to live amongst the people and lead them and kind of show them how to worship this God. Now that might sound weird to you. Like, why wouldn't they want to keep worshiping their Assyrian gods? Well, in this time and place, gods were very much connected with the place in which they worshiped. So if you went to Egypt, you would not have expected Egypt to worship the same God that you did. Likewise, Israel. Like, everyone had their own god or goddesses they worshiped, and those god and goddesses were connected to the land, the place, the people group that had lived there. So they realize, oh, well, we're in this land and we're not worshiping the God of the land. So we need to figure out how to do that. So that's why they bring an Israelite priest. And this leads to all sorts of interesting practices as described in 2 Kings 17, verse 34. They kind of have like a hybrid version of the Israelite religion. It's not exactly right, but it's something that kind of sounds a lot like it. There's some similarities. How about that? So these people in time are going to become what we know as the Samaritans. That will be their name when we encounter them during the ministry of Jesus Christ. So they'll become the Samaritans, and they are much reviled by what remains of Israel during Jesus' time. So just kind of heads up. And by the way, at the time in which I'm recording this, there is so much violence. There is war going on in the Middle East yet again. There are continued struggles between Israelites and the Palestinians. This goes all the way back to this history. This is where it starts. All this animosity and fighting and bloodshed going on in the same region. And here we are thousands of years later. And unfortunately, not much has changed. A lot has changed, and then not much has changed at all. So after the northern kingdom is exiled, all that remains is the kingdom of Judah. And you would think that they would have heard what happened to their brother and sister tribes up in the northern kingdom and said, oh, we need to get ourselves straight. But that is not what happens. Most of their kings are just as bad as those of Israel. There's a few good kings, and so I want to talk about their stories, that do try to reform the nation. So the first is Hezekiah, and he reigned during the lifetime of the prophet Isaiah. So we'll meet Isaiah in his own book. He has one of the most important books in all of the Old Testament. So we'll talk more about him when we get to that book. But just know that he aligns with Hezekiah, and we see his name mentioned in the story of Hezekiah. After the northern kingdom was taken captive by Assyria, Hezekiah stands up to the Assyrian ruler Sennacherib. He removes the high places and cuts down all the Asherah poles, so all the bad things that had happened in the southern kingdom. He sees what happens in the north, and he's like, I got to get this straightened out. So he tears down all the altars to false gods. But he also has a blind spot, a prideful spot, we might say, and he allows Babylonia to get a foothold. So he's so busy worrying about Assyria that he doesn't see the threat that Babylon poses. And so he allows these envoys from Babylonia to come, and he shows them everything in his kingdom. The Bible says everything. He opens up every storehouse and shows him all his riches and what he has. And that's not good. He's trusting someone that's going to end up being an enemy, and he just gives away way too much information and intel to them. So then we have, in between Hezekiah and Josiah, we have Manasseh and his son Amon. They're wicked. I'll talk about Manasseh in a minute. And then we have Josiah. So he also tries to institute reform. His high priest at the time, Hilkiah, it said, found the book of the law. So the book of the law is the covenant. It is the terms of the covenant. It is the Mosaic law. It's what they're supposed to be reading once a year. It had become lost. That's how bad things had gotten. They find it. Josiah realizes how bad things have been. He has the people renew the covenant. He also tears down high places and destroys false idols and tries to kind of clean everything up and bring the people back to the right worship of God. But it's too late. The damage had already been done, and God had already pronounced judgment during the reign of Manasseh. So Manasseh is the straw that breaks the camel's back. He is the ruler that finally incurs so much wrath from God that God says, that's it, you're going to get taken into exile too. So as I said, he's in between the reigns of Hezekiah and Josiah, and he is the most wicked of all the kings. He rebuilt the high places and altars to false gods that Hezekiah tore down. He bowed down and worshipped false gods himself. He built altars to them inside the temple where God was supposed to be, where God's presence reigned. He built altars to false gods. Like, that is so, so, so bad. He sacrificed one of his sons in the fire to the god Moloch. He practiced divination and witchcraft. And he got all the people to follow him and to stop listening to God as well. And it said of him that they did more evil than the nations the Lord had destroyed before the Israelites. So we talked a lot about how bad the Canaanites were. They were doing even worse. And finally, God said, enough. Judah, southern kingdom, you will be taken captive and taken into exile as well, just like the northern kingdom. So the southern kingdom is also exiled, and that begins in 605 BC. And there's a few waves that take place. And it's not Assyria that carries them off, it's going to be Babylon. So initially, Judah is defeated under the reign of King Jehoiakim by Babylon. And then Nebuchadnezzar lays siege to the city of Jerusalem during the reign of the next king, which is Jehoiakim. So there's Jehoiakim, two different people. So he carries off the king to Babylon, the nobles, all of the skilled workers, and he pilfers the temple. So he takes out all of the treasures, the lampstand, all the things that are supposed to reside in the temple. And he installs a puppet king, Zedekiah. So Zedekiah is from Judah. He's an Israelite, but he rules for and on behalf of Nebuchadnezzar. In 586, Zedekiah rebels and tries to kind of off-put the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. And that causes Nebuchadnezzar to come back and besiege Jerusalem once again, and it causes the people within Jerusalem to starve. And he finally conquers the city, and he destroys the temple completely, not just, pilfering it, but tearing it down to the ground, and then he burns all of Jerusalem. So he leaves Jerusalem an utter wasteland, nothing left standing. He carried into exile the rest of the people, except a very, very few of the poorest people who were allowed to stay and work in the fields. But everyone else gets taken to Babylon. And then he installs a final puppet king, Gedaliah, to rule over Jerusalem. Now, when all of these events had happened, there were some Judeans who had fled to try to escape what was happening. When Gedaliah is installed, they kind of meet back up with him at Mizpah. And he says, don't worry, if you serve Nebuchadnezzar, it's going to be okay for you. Like, come back, you can live here, and I'll protect you. But that's not what happens. They're all killed. Gedaliah is killed, as well as all of the people. So there were even a few people still who fled to Egypt, but they would be killed in Egypt as well. So no one that fled survived. The people that got taken into exile did survive. Babylon was not as harsh as Assyria. They didn't murder the people like the Assyrians did. And in fact, life in exile is actually not so bad for them. Like, they treat them well. But we'll talk more about that next week. So this is a hopeless end to this story. What began as a ragtag group of people coming out of Egypt that God bound together through the law of his covenant, through his love and his mercy and his grace. Those people journeyed through the desert, struggled with faithfulness, one generation dying without ever getting to see the promised land because they could not be faithful. The next generation taking up the charge, leading them into the promised land via the leadership of Joshua, showing faithfulness, for the most part doing what God has asked, although not fully and completely, settled the land. The time of Judges was awful, everyone doing whatever they wanted. They needed and wanted central human leadership. God gave them that. And for a while during the rule of the kings, things seemed okay. But it wasn't to last. The kingdom divided. Israel immediately said, "You're going into exile because you're so wicked. You set up a whole nother religion. So out with you." But it took a while before that exile actually happened. Judah had more time, and then under Manasseh, God said, "That's it. You're going into exile too." But there was a bit of time that elapsed from the reign of Manasseh to when the events of exile actually happened. And so Kings ends with the people in exile and really no Israelites remaining in the promised land. Seems pretty hopeless, but but hope remains. And we'll see hope spoken of when we get to the individual books of the prophets. But I want to leave you with a word of hope here, because there were prophecies. God had spoken through his prophets words of hope. He had promised that one day, despite the fact that everyone was going to go into exile, one day a remnant of the people would return. One day Jerusalem would be rebuilt. And in those prophecies, remember I spoke of the layers of prophecy and that he would talk about things that would happen in 20 or 30 years' time, in 70 years' time, in 1,000 years' time with Jesus, in 2,000 years or whatever. We don't even know how long before Jesus returns again. And so Isaiah had a prophecy that really speaks to Jesus, and it's going to be familiar to some of you from what we read at Christmas. But let me read this to you, because as we imagine the people brokenhearted in exile, wondering where they went wrong, would God ever be their God again? Would he really make a way from them to return? They had this word of hope to cling to. Isaiah says in chapter 9 of his book, verse 2, "The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. You have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest, as warriors rejoice when dividing the plunder. For as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. Every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning, will be fuel for the fire. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing it and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this." So hear those words. People walking in darkness, the people in exile, the people without hope, the people who thought there was no way forward, the people who thought God had abandoned them forever. He says, no, there is one coming. There is one coming who's going to do more than we could ever imagine. So hope remains, and we will pick up the story in the next segment of reading. So next we're going to look at 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And Chronicles is going to repeat a lot of this history, but it's also going to take us into the time of hope, into the time of return. So before we get there, let's just pause and consider what we've learned here from Kings. Lessons from 1st and 2nd Kings. Well, we've seen God's sovereignty. Yes, God allows free will, but he will intervene. There are boundaries, and when you cross the boundaries too many times, God has something to say about that. He intervened when Israel completely lost their way. He removed his hand of blessing and protection, and he allowed them to be taken into exile. We also see that God is with his people. So the people of Israel, for the most part, they couldn't rely on their kings. Their leaders, the leaders of the kings and the one queen, were not good except for a few, but they did have the prophets. And so God entered into the midst of the people through the voices and stories and lives of the prophets. They were God's representatives, and they were able to warn the people and give them hope about a future redemption that was coming. So, yes, you don't have a lot of agency to be able to affect change. You're not a leader, you're not a king. So, what do? Hold fast because I am at work. That's the message. And we'll see this when we get to the standalone books of the prophets. It is the same time period. It's just a different perspective. It's really God's perspective of this same time period that we've just looked at in the historical books. And in God's perspective, we've started to learn that he plays the long game. We saw that, for instance, so beautifully depicted in the story of Ruth. We're beginning to see hints of what the long game will culminate in, or rather, who. Someone is coming, and you'll see this built upon when we get to the books of the prophets. We see God's justice at work in the books of the kings. God did what he said he would do. He told the people, if you rebel, if you do not uphold the covenant, if you turn to false gods, this is what's going to happen to you. You're going to lose the blessing of land. You're going to lose the blessing of fruitfulness, and you will be expelled from the land. And that is exactly what happened. They became so unfruitful that they are eating their own. Do you see the imagery from being fruitful and having multiple children and generations numerous as the stars to starving and eating their children? That's quite a juxtaposition, but that is how bad things got. They go from having this beautiful land that's provided for them and fed them and sustained them to being kicked out of that land and having that land repopulated by other people. So God does not and did not withhold justice, even though these were his chosen people, even though this was the nation he chose for himself to be his ambassadors, to be his missionaries, to be his hands and feet. Yes, they were loved by God, as are all of us. But God also is a God of justice. Love and justice are intertwined when it comes to God. And he cannot fully and completely love us if he allows unjust things to go unchecked. And here we see what happens when God speaks out against the injustices happening. All right, so that brings us to the end of 1st and 2nd Kings. As I said, next week or in the next lecture, we will look at the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which really is just everything from first, halfway, well, maybe like the end of 2nd Samuel, all the way to the end of 2nd Kings. But a little bit of a different perspective there. And then we'll move on to the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther, which speak to what happens after exile. And indeed, God does make a way for our remnant to come back. And that's going to set the scene for the arrival of Jesus. So a lot of good reading ahead of us. So I hope you turn back in for 1st and 2nd Chronicles.